Good morning. Good to talk to you all this morning. We're going to be continuing our study in the book of James, and we'll be finishing up most of chapter 1 today. Looking at this text over the past week, I thought a lot about the power and the difficulty of James chapter 1. Remember, we talked some last week about how James likely wrote this book near the end of his life. And this was a very difficult time for Jewish Christians, which were most of the people that James ministered to. He lived in Jerusalem. He writes this book to the Jewish Christians that live out in the Greek and Roman world. And this was a difficult time because not only were they enduring a lot of persecution and prejudice, but Jerusalem was destroyed right after James died. And James himself had been killed by the Pharisees right after he wrote this letter. It's just a very difficult political time. And these circumstances are what make this book such a practical book for us in 2020, or really any difficult time in our lives. The first chapter of James is all about dealing with difficult and unusual circumstances. It's a very powerful text to read and think about your own struggles and difficulties. I think the greatest power in James chapter 1 is not, though, that it is a great passage to go to when you are having a hard time. I would even say that I think the Psalms, or maybe the words of Jesus in the Gospels, are much more comforting than the first chapter of James. But here's the great thing about James chapter 1. It's a great passage to go to read, and to know, to prepare you before you go through difficult times. It gives you a way to look at the world that we live in and better prepares us to handle the struggles that we go through. So with that in mind, kind of keeping that in your head as the framework for what we're looking at here, let's dig into James chapter 1, starting at about verse 5 and going to about verse 8. It says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways." What's going on in James chapter 1 and verse 5? I've learned something this week as I was looking at this text that I really didn't know before. I think I've always been a bit confused by verse 5 here. Why does James bring up wisdom out of the blue? He's been talking about counting our trials as joy and about having an enduring faith, and it just immediately swaps gears to wisdom here in verse 5. He mentions that God gives freely without reproach, but then he also says, don't doubt, or you're like someone tossed on the waves. I think I've always read this as something of a warning, like ask God for wisdom, but you better not hesitate when you ask God. You better not lack faith, because if you lack faith, then you might as well not even ask. And I want to suggest to you this morning that that's actually the wrong way to read this text. That's not what James is saying at all. There is no mention of God punishing you for not having faith. It's just emphasizing how important faith is. This text has a context. It belongs in the book of James, and that matters a lot to what it's actually trying to say. James is doing two things here in verses 5 through 8. First, he's referring back to what he's already said. In verses 2 through 4, he talked about how we need to count suffering as joy, and how we need a faith that is steadfast or endures. In other words, a faith that lasts, a faith that is indestructible. Enduring struggles is not easy on our faith. It doesn't come naturally. And most commentators agree that what James is saying here in verse 5 is not a sudden change of subject, but he is continuing his thoughts. He's saying if you need wisdom to know how to endure your struggles and your difficulties, to know how to deal with them and keep your faith strong, how to count them as joy, then ask God. He will help you to be wise, to get some understanding. In fact, we see a very clear link between verses 4 and 5 in one particular word. Let's read verses 4 and 5 of James chapter 1 and pay close attention to what it says. It says, "And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him." James is using this word, lacks. He says in verse 4, if you have a faith that endures, you'll lack in nothing, you'll be complete. And then immediately in verse 5, "But if you lack in wisdom, then ask God for it." He's using wisdom as just one example of the things that an enduring faith can receive from God. That's why you need to have a faith that endures, is so that when you ask wisdom, you'll receive it. You'll believe God can do that for you. We also see James introducing here one of the key themes of his book, generosity. God is a wonderful giver who gives without reproof. I love the way James says that. That's such an amazing image. I think it's scary sometimes to ask for help, especially to ask people for something like a physical possession, because it costs them to help you in that scenario. It always really costs somebody something to do something for you. It might cost them time, it might cost them effort, it might just cost them a lot of worry and stress. And James tells us we can ask God for things. We can ask God for wisdom because God gives freely. He's not going to get mad at us. There is no reproof here for asking. The emphasis, in fact, is on how the only thing required to receive from God is the act of asking and believing that He will give to you, believing in His generous nature. This is a major theme of the book of James. God is the opposite of selfish. He is perfectly generous, the giver of all good gifts, as we'll see a little bit later in the book. James tells us you must not doubt Him. And I read that and I think it's interesting. It kind of brings into our mind, why would we doubt God? And it's because we doubt promises that sound too good to be true. We're used to bad salesmen, to internet ads, to get rich quick schemes, to politicians. James is not talking about punishment for doubting God. He's instead focusing on how God, unlike everything else, is trustworthy. And if we can't trust Him, we're going to be floating through life without a guide or a direction. The Bible tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. How can we expect to receive wisdom if we don't have that first, a fear, a faith in God? James is using this request for wisdom as a clear example of what he described in verses 2 through 4. If we let endurance and steadfastness do its work, then we'll be complete. We won't lack the Christian qualities that we need to serve God, like wisdom. Let's continue on a little bit further and read verses 9 through 11. It says, "Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation. Because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuit." Here we get the third theme that James is going to focus on in this book, sinful desires. He says that the lowly man should boast in his exaltation. That is, the person who's humble or poor, depending on your translation, should boast about the blessings that he's received from God. Likewise, the rich man should boast in his humbling or humiliation, because like the flower in the grass, riches don't last forever. The rich man will fade away in the midst of his pursuits. This is the first of many times James will deal with the dangers of earthly wealth to the people of God. So what is James trying to say here? I think it's a little hard reading this passage because he uses this word boast. And, Generally, that's not something we're supposed to do as Christians, or at least that's not something I think of as what we're supposed to do. We shouldn't brag about the things that we have, just like we shouldn't be coveting the things that others have. But I think James is talking here very similar to what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. And I think Paul's got a pretty good take on this idea. Paul in Romans 5, 1 through 5 says, "Therefore, since we've been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him also we have obtained access by faith into his grace, in which we stand, and we..." Now your translation might say rejoice here, but it's the same word in James. It's boast. "In which we boast in hope of the glory of God. Not only in that, but we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and that endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us." Paul tells us that we should boast about our hope in the glory of God. He says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10, that he's going to boast in his weakness. For as a child of God, when he's weak, when he can't do anything himself, then he must completely rely on God. That's when his faith is the strongest. I read this passage in James chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, and I picture two different faithful Christians. I picture a person that's gone through a lot of financial difficulties, who's received the help that they need, and rejoices, praises God, tells everybody about how they've been blessed. I remember when I was in college, I was going through a real hard time. I didn't have much financially, and I was working about 40 to 60 hours a week overnight as a baker at Panera Bread, and I wasn't really making it. I didn't have enough money to pay for my tuition. I barely had enough financial stuff to get everything together, and I wasn't able to do my work and do my school. And I was very blessed. The church stepped in and paid for my tuition. I was able to quit my job so that I could focus on school and become the preacher I am today. And it was this amazing moment where I was exalted. I was lifted up. I was helped in a way that I did not deserve or had not earned. And you know what I did when that happened? I wanted to tell everybody about it, about how God helped me. I didn't deserve this. I did not earn it. But God has helped me in my struggle. And I think that's what we should do with the blessings of God. We should boast about how God gives us good and kind gifts that we don't deserve, about He's there for us. And when He lifts us up out of a hard time, I think that's something to praise Him about. Likewise, I think of this second image of the rich man being humbled. And I picture the Christian who's had a great deal of physical blessings, but may be experiencing a season of difficulty. And they don't abandon God or curse Him, but instead they tell the story of how God has blessed them through their life. And about how even though they're going through difficulty now, they have not forgotten what God's done for them in the past. The suffering that they're going through produces in them, just like Paul talked about in Romans 5, perseverance, character, and hope. And they boast about that hope, that they may be low now, but they know God's going to be there with them and help them in this struggle. James' book is a book of practical wisdom. Like Proverbs, it contains some basic and true statements about life. And it combines those with some true statements about God. It's very similar to the messages from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And it gives us in the last part of this section a clear look at all the topics James is going to focus on for the rest of this letter. There are three things the book of James is really going to stick to, talk about. And that is a steadfast or enduring faith, generosity, and desire, specifically selfish desire versus selfless good desire. He began in verses 2 through 4 telling us about the need for steadfast faith. He told us about the generosity of God in verses 5 through 8. And he's already brought up the fleeting nature of worldly desires in verses 9 through 11. So let's take a look at the last part of this section, how he wraps all this together in verses 12 through 18. I love James 12 through 18. It's very powerful. It says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those that love him. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." James explains to us the power of an enduring faith. He tells us, hey, you may be going through something in your life right now, but don't you know that it's the person who remains steadfast, the person that doesn't give up on God, that holds on to God, that's going to receive the crown of life that God gives to those that love him. We got to hold on. When we're going through trials, we're going to deal with some temptations. So keep a close eye on your heart, because when it's when you're hurting most that the devil comes after you. God tempts no one, but our own desires tempt us away from God, and they can give birth to sin. Just like the rich man that fades away in the midst of his pursuits that James already talked about. Temptations can pull us away from God and keep us so distracted that we die spiritually. And James ends this section with a reminder that we're not enduring alone, that we're not facing temptations by ourselves. God is the giver of every good gift, and we can pray to him for help, for wisdom, as James has already mentioned. He gives freely, without reproach or anger, and every good gift comes from him. And he loves us like the first fruits of the harvest. James is really saying something very similar to what Jesus said in his Beatitudes. And I want you to turn there with me and read Matthew 5, 3 through 11 as we close this morning. Starting in Matthew 5, verse 3. It says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." God is the giver of every good gift to all those that are struggling, no matter what that struggle is. God is the one who makes the poor in spirit blessed, who gives them the kingdom of heaven. God is the one who gives comfort to those that mourn. God is the one who allows the meek to inherit power. God is the one who helps those that hunger and thirst for righteousness to find it. This morning, James reminds us that we need a faith that endures temptations, that we need to believe in God and his desire to help us through our struggles, to give us wisdom and strength, and that we need to be focused on God before anything else. That's the powerful message of James chapter 1. I hope that this encourages you this week as you deal with your own struggles. And I hope God's with you this week in everything that you do. Thank you.